Okay. So here we are again, doing another one of our videos. And this one here, I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out. But I would classify this as one of those action speaks louder than words type videos. Because we go off and ramble on different saws, and we like this one, that one. We build 390s and small ones and big ones. But when you look at this table, all the saws in this table are ones that Bob and I personally own and use. And I can tell you, both of us, when push comes to shove and there's a question about what saw do you want to grab for a particular job or a particular event, one of these is always in the truck, on the tractor, on the job. So, bottom line is this: if you were to ask either one of us, if you were to pick one saw or one chassis that you depend on, would pick to do most of the jobs, most versatile, and a whole bunch of other adjectives and phrases, sooner or later the 372 bubbles up to the top. And should anyone question that, look at the freaking table. These are all our saws.
Yeah.
Each one of these are ones that reside in our vehicles or on the job. And I think what we need to do is introduce the cast of characters, and Bob's going to have a unique perspective on all of them as well as usual. So we'll start with that.
Well, this is the first in what we started calling the 372 victory lap.
Yeah.
Because as the 372 rides off into the sunset, once the 572 comes out, and the latest date on the 572 now is February of 2037. No, the latest date is supposed to be this February, but you know, we're going to do a series on, well, I guess we kind of think this is one of the best chassis ever, and we've each got 5 of them here, and we got quite a few different flavors. The only thing that we really don't have is one of the 47 millimeter 362 XP.
The small mouths.
Or I do own 2163W, but that's the winter saw with the heated grips, and I just didn't feel like bringing it up. It's supposed to hit 86 today.
And you only have so much space in this table.
The table's about ready to collapse.
Point being that these, again, are all our personal saws.
So it's kind of like, you know, we can't wrap any hobbyists, and most of you guys watching this, you can't really wrap your mind around the concept if you can only have one saw. So for the addicted types like ourselves, you said, well, if you could only have one chassis, what would it be? And several models on that chassis. So we said, well, a 372. And we've got plenty of them here. So a quick rundown. We've got 48 millimeters, which is a whole narrative that we're going to get into a little bit. 50 millimeters, 52 millimeter, or 51.5 millimeter, the OEM big bore kit.
Yeah.
We got the Chinese big bore kits, the 52 millimeters. One of the saws here is a kit saw, which is the 50 millimeter aftermarket. I'm going to build one, which we'll show later, like to actually have an open port 50. There's like so many variations here, and it's kind of our intention. We're going to get like one of everything. So I guess we got to start taking them off the table.
Let's start over here.
Start at that end.
And again, these are personal saws. This one here is the kit saw, I think.
You know that skirt here that we always take this skirt down so it matches the level? Well, you know, with this one it's kind of already there. There's really not much you got to do. So it's just kind of an oddball thing that I'm going to put together because there never was a 50 millimeter open port, whatever. Yeah, I know a lot of people. I got this thing I've always been saying for years now, like the open port saws, like Rodney Dangerfield. They don't get any respect.
They run,
but you know they get it done. The other thing that really should be kind of also shown there, you know, there's some question about the reliability or the viability of rubber parts in the aftermarket world. Even though you can't even get that top end anymore from Husqvarna, you still can get the intake bits. And what I probably should have left this out. This is just a little detour from the program. The fun stuff's coming up shortly, I guarantee it. I'm just going to win an argument that we've been having for a while. Sorry. So anyway, you have this different intake where you have, it's actually, there's a clamp involved. It's different as opposed to that one that goes around the boot. You have this totally different intake. What's interesting about this is you can still get this, if you're concerned about the rubber and the aftermarket parts, you can still get this from Husky. All right, now, this is the part that I've been waiting for. Because, and I'm in an awkward position here because, Walt's, kind enough to host me up at the farm, and this is his video channel. I'm in the awkward and uncomfortable position having to say he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, he has besmirched the reputation of the bottom ends on the X-Torques. And I will concede that from his perspective, I can understand him drawing a conclusion like that. But there's a few facts that you have to kind of, for factors to put in the equation here to kind of ameliorate some of his accusations that are unfounded. First of all,
see, I'm going to school here. See, one of the things about this channel always is good, better, and different. Whether I like to hear it or not, I always put it on the channel.
Okay, so he's put out a lot of bad vibes about the lower ends on the X-Torq, the second generation, which is about like 10 years now. The X-Torq versions are on these saws is wasting the bottom ends and the PTO bearings. They really, part of his perspective is based on the fact that he's a little bit like me in the sense that he's the only guy within 50 miles of here that'll work on bottom ends and replace bearings. And most dealers can't do it, most dealers won't do it. And I'm kind of in a similar situation. My rep told me that out of 82 dealers in the territory, there's only 4 of us that'll actually split in the bottom end and put bearings in a saw. Most of the shops, oh no, it's junk, Okay, I get that. So what happens is other shops, that word gets out. It gets out to guys that waste bearings. And so the word gets out, and it's like, hey, there's this guy in Cortland that'll do the bottom end, and he's good. Okay, so he gets a higher percentage of failed bottom ends than the average shop gets. So things are skewed a little bit there. The other thing that's a little bit skewed is, Walt's only really been doing this, with other people's saws now for probably maybe 4 or 5 years, which is halfway into the 10 years that the X-Torques have been out. I've been doing this for like 25 years. And so my perspective is a little bit different in the sense that, the occasional, and I'm going to stress, occasional time that you waste that PTO bearing, that was happening with the earlier saws. It's not something that's just happens with the X-Torques. There was a period, and I think he must have talked about it when he redid the bottom end in his 2172. There was a period where there was a little factory issue there, and the bearings weren't being installed right, and so that caused like an uptick in some failures. I did see some of those, but the saws that come to him, he's seeing like a high failure rate. If I had that kind of a high failure rate across my customer base, I've been hung or shot somewhere for selling them. The truth is, like what I see is it's an acceptable level of failures, okay? So what I've seen is that, I have a couple here. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but I got 2 older saws that are, and these are pre-X-Torques, and both of these lost the PTO side. And just like most of Walt's saws are the same guy, these are the same guy. His name is Tom, and I don't think he really watches these, but he's brutal on these things. So sometimes if you see a lot of failures in anything, if it's across a wide range of customers, then we better look at the machines. But if you got one guy, multiple failures, and you're not seeing it from anybody else or from very many other people, then we got a customer issue. And that's one of the first things you look at. Now one of these, this is from an X-Torq, a fairly recent one, but it's a totally different failure. I'll get into that in a second. So my experience goes back, and I have, Walt's got some shops, they give him some work, and he's got a couple of pro customers that are just really hard on stuff.
Yeah,
and
they are.
And I've got, like I said, Tom and his brother too. They're just tough on saws, and they just lunch a lot of stuff. One of the things they got in common is my guy and Walt's guy that has this epidemic of bottom end failures. They have the adjustment tool, and like my guy Tom said, oh, you got to turn them up or they don't cut. And it's like, oh, the worst thing I ever did was give him that adjustment tool. I mean, he would have got one anyway, and so I wouldn't have been able to prevent that from happening. So my contention is that there are a small amount. I mean, I've probably got 100, you know, professional, you know, commercial customers on these. If you include the loggers and the tree service guys, all right. And I'm also, like, since the X-Torq came out, I probably averaged, you know, the average is like selling like 50 a year just out of my shop. Plus I see guys coming from other areas. If I saw the amount of failures that, honestly, that Walt sees as a percentage basis, I wouldn't even have these things in the store. So I think that there's, for some of you guys who have been watching that, because he gets frustrated with stuff, and I get frustrated with stuff too. But some of the stuff that, if I was seeing them like that, I'd be really scared of selling them. But it's just not. And I don't see really any more of these than on any of the other big saws. A lot of it has to do with how guys file their chains, guys that run their chains too tight. Guys do all kinds of strange things. And when you see stuff is concentrated across a narrow customer base, then it's you got to look at the customer before you look at the saw. You have a moment to respond here.
Oh, I have a lot of, well, a couple of things. Basically what Bob is saying is over a period of time, statistically, he's not seeing more failures on the X-Torqs than he did the original editions.
Correct.
That's the short side. The second thing he's saying is all the saws I see come through my shop, since I don't sell new saws, are repairs, which means all of them are going to have a problem. And the predominant problem I see on the X-Torqs are PTO bearings. But the only reason they're coming to me is because they had a problem. They're not coming to me because they're happy they want someone to paint them.
Well, the truth, what I was saying before, most dealers will not do bottom end work.
Having said that, there's a couple of points I want to make sure are understood. It's not just one customer. One, basically, the X-Torqs that I got were the early 2010 versions, and they were whooped everywhere. It's just that the PTO side was so wobbled out that I couldn't do anything with them. And actually, I'm going to ship those cases out to one of our channel members to see if he can't add some material and take it away and end up with a good case. That's another whole deal. The second thing is, yeah, there's a point where one fella wasted a whole bunch of saws in a hurry, and I think one of the common denominators might be that this guy has a crew. They're not his, you know, they're his saws, the company saws, but they go to people who don't care. So, yeah,
A lot of sources don't want to come up with a solution, and you know, here again, the old Walter Brennan line from the Guns and Will Sonnet, you know, no brag, just fact. But the truth is, like, we're out of those 82 dealers, we're the biggest saw dealer in the territory, and I get a better, a wider cross section of users and guys that are, you know, coming in. You know, I think one of the things too is it took a while for people to realize, even dealers, that when the X-Torqs first came out, that, you know, they don't go to 13.5, they go to 13.
Well,
and some of the dealers won't even adjust them to begin with. You know, it's funny, like the two where we had the PTO bearing failures, and here again, you know, we're, like I said, no brag, just fact, we're the biggest out of those 82 dealers. We're the biggest saw dealer in the territory by pretty decent margin. So we see a much wider cross section of stuff. Here again, to me, I look at these two saws that failed, and of course I saved these because, you know, we're going to show you why in a second. But you know, the fact that these were both owned by the same guy, I'm looking at the guy. I'm not looking at the saws. The one X-Torq I have here that is a failure, which is this one. You can see some wear here. Now somebody wasn't paying attention on this one. This crank is kind of separated a little bit, and it was rubbing on this inside. Okay, this is the flywheel side, and this was rubbing until finally the guy said, "Yeah, this saw ain't right." And I didn't sell this saw, and I think this is not an adjustment issue on the dealer that did sell it. The problem is this crank just wasn't pressed together correctly. And honest to God, this is the only time I've ever seen this. I've never seen one of these before. Yeah, but that thing, you can see that's wide, and it was rubbing on the inside on your flywheel side. The other side of this is your PTO side. Look how clean that is. So this will get used, okay, somewhere.
So I should take those cranks and hammer them apart. It will clean up the inside of those cases.
Yeah, right. You can polish your cases with the crank, okay. So it's just something to there's you know, a lot of times there's explanations, and you know, I'm just seeing, I just got a wider, you know, Walt's got a scientific mind. I just have a wider base of data to draw a conclusion from. So that's why I'm drawing a little different conclusion.
And again, the conclusion is statistically there's no difference.
Exactly. Yeah, the fact that you're you know, here again, but that's what made this kind of caused a little bit of an illusion with the statistics. First of all, there was that period in 2011, and that's why, and your 2172 fell into that.
Well, I was going to get into
Fell
that.
into that, but you know, those bearings were not put in right, and there was something wrong with the machining. So there was like a 4 or 5 month period where stuff wasn't coming out right. So that increased some bottom end failures, and the fact that, you know, it took a while for a lot of people to realize that, you know, don't look for that other 500 RPMs because the X-Torques don't have it. And you know, here again, I mean, I don't see any more failures.
But we did a video on that almost 3, possibly 4 years ago, where
Yeah.
where we were seeing the X-Torques, where a guy had them bouncing off the rev limiters.
Yeah.
And we had come up with a recommendation of,
And that's worth repeating. It
Yeah.
really is.
and I will concede that those kind of factors are going to increase the chances of failure. Obviously, they're gonna. And one point that I'm going to say that augments what Bob said is I have not seen a saw come in with a bottom end failure that has a tag later than 2016, with the exception of the ones that were straight gassed. And
Yeah.
the ones that were straight gassed, interestingly enough, the bearings didn't fail.
Anyway, so that's the reason I did that. We were having some, actually we didn't pick on each other as much as we have been. But I thought like, because, you know, Walt really came into this, you know, halfway through the introduction of the X-Torq, you know, and, you know, I thought that he's seen enough of this where if he talks about them a lot, that people think that the X-Torques have a much, much higher failure rate on the bottom ends than the original ones. And so my thing is that if you look at a wider body of evidence and information, they really don't. Plus a wider body of customers, which, you know, believe me, some of these guys are just brutal on everything.
So the net is, as we said before, statistically they're normal. My channel, I document everything, so you see it real time, and statistically that skews, in Bob's mind, that skews the information, which it does, because the only thing you're going to see is me repairing a saw. Actually, there's some good news in all this. There really is. And statistically, that's the same. Okay, I concede that point. If I see that over time, you're going to see that over time, because that's the way it's going to show up in the channel. The counterpoints to that in me is things like that 365. I have seen so many of those older ones. Do you remember those ones early on where we had a bunch of old dead 372s, and we built a couple of saws from that?
Yeah.
Do you realize that saw that I got from you, that case I got from you, is still out there cutting wood?
Mm-hmm.
Unreal. And that's one of the original editions.
Sorry to say though, it's like, you know, there are still like original, like that guy that brought in the original X-Torq, and it's like before the piston change. You know, that's still running. So there's plenty of original saws still running. So, you know, they can never even out. You know, the oldest X-Torq is still going to be, you know, 10 years newer than the average. So it's going to be hard to kind of quantify that. But as long as we can see, you know, that there's a lot of, and here again, did it go into a full-time, I mean, how many full-time loggers are still running the original 372? Yeah, these guys, well, I know, you just said one, right?
Well, the
Maybe
one
a couple.
guy,
All right, well,
the
well,
one guy
I
who gave me two of the, you know, the two X-Torques he gave me from 2010. They weren't just wore out, and their PTO bearings, yeah, they were gone, but every other surface, screw, moving part of that saw was worn beyond the leaf. So it's not one that points to a bad set of bearings. That saw was wore out. But to Bob's point, and this is case in point, called me up 2 weeks ago and said, you know, I still have my old XPW, and it's still cutting wood. It's not running like it used to. You think you could refurb that saw? So he bought that saw in 2009.
Yeah.
And it's still cutting wood.
Right. And what I was starting to say is that there are still guys that bought the original X-Torq when it first came out, and there's a lot of old X-Torqs running too. the point I was making before is that, you know, they're always gonna have like a 10 or 12-year gap
Yeah.
between the X-Torq. So, you know, here again, okay, that guy he wore out some X-Torques, he's still got an old XPW.
And we don't
that
know
still
we don't
works.
know the specific
But
history.
But what's just one guy? You
Right.
can't draw conclusions from one guy. You know, I'm seeing like 100 different customers. You know, so that's all I'm saying is like the wider body of data that you have, you know, you can get a little clearer picture of what's going on. There are guys that are still running X-Torques that are old, you know, but a lot of full-time loggers, you know, let's face it, these guys use up saws.
It don't
know,
matter what they are. They're
You
gonna
know,
use
so
them
if
up.
you got a guy that, you know, had bought a 371 when it first came out just to heat his house, you know, that's
your
one
favorite.
set of circumstances, but you know, there's not too many loggers that bought 371s that are still running.
Well, my favorite customer, who is now your favorite customer, started out by wearing out a pair of steel 441s. Threw them out. Started with the X-Torques. Wasted a couple of those. I replaced them. And the second part I'm going to say is those saws that I've done the bottom end repairs on. I guess the first one was 2014 for him. They're still out there. They're still running.
One of the characteristics that is, I'm sure, is in play there, is that you set the RPMs when they went out.
Bingo.
Most dealers probably, I know for a fact, oh, the factory settings. Well, you know what? They ain't right. The thing I find with the X-Torques is you really got to wind them down when they're new, and then they lose RPM. That's why I tell these guys, you know, I got to send these out fat. It's going to start dropping. Then you got to bring it back, and I'll turn it back up. If you let them go out, they're just too squirrely. You know, they're hitting the rev limiter.
Well, I think
At least at, you know, wherever altitude I'm at.
yeah, I think a part of the thing that you're bringing up, we brought this up a few years back, and that's the dealer setup side. This guy here sets them up. He knows enough to do that because and they don't come back. And I think that's a bigger part of the equation than you want to let on, to be honest with you. Because the first set of bearings that I did were not from one person. They were from a diverse set of people. But they came from a set of dealers that literally they were either bought at Boonville in a box, or they were bought by one of the big dealers in a box, and they were delivered in a box, and they were not looked at, and which is another factor here. And when I got a couple of those guys' saws, actually Matt is a guy who bought one, and when I first got his 372, it was a 2015 version, it was bouncing off the rev limiter, and we turned it down to 12.9 in the fall time.
Right.
And it was on the rev limiter in the wintertime, and I turned it down then. But those first set of saws that I had to do bearing repairs for definitely had not been set up. Definitely had not been set up. And what happens is, Bob said this, but I'm going to articulate it again because it's worth saying. And this absolutely has to have an effect on the bearing failures. It has to, because of the different characteristics of the crank and the piston. And we went through this in the videos, Bob. But the thing is that a guy who's tuning by ear is used to hearing in the old style 372, and they would go right to 13.5, sometimes 13.7. They sound nice. So now you get the new 372, it has the same number on it, and you're in there, like he was saying, you got the wrench, try to make it sound the same, completely different saw design. The piston's larger, it's taller, it's a different animal, and it's designed to run in the 13,000 RPM range, not 13.5. And as you pointed out, the first ignition systems actually had the 13.3 that they were rev limited to.
Yeah.
So this is what happens. The guy gets a saw, it's already lean. He wants to make it sound like the other 372 he has in the truck. So he starts trying to lean it out to get the RPMs out. And he keeps turning in, nothing happens. Right? So what's he doing? He's leaned it out to where it's on the rev limiter, but he hasn't changed the top RPM because the ignition is what's setting the top RPM, not the carburetor. So he takes a couple of swipes with that screwdriver, leans it out, and that thing is still bouncing on 13.3. He gives up. Most of them are not going to be smart enough to wind it back out until he's going to have some kind of reaction to the carburetor. They just give up and leave. So now what they have is a terminally lean saw that sounds no different than when he first started trying to tune it, but the difference is probably a half a turn on the high-speed screw in. And now you end up with a lean saw, and that's part of what's going to take out those bearings. You know, just higher.
Well, sometimes it's, you know, is the saw tuned to pass an emissions test, or is it tuned to pass the test of time? And,
But we have guys, and there's legitimacy to this as well. I remember we had a guy, and I convinced him to turn it down to 12.8. And he started bitching and moaning about how that saw just didn't cut as fast. Because the guy could tell the difference between 12.8 and 13.1. You know? So he had to keep it right there at that sweet spot for him. Otherwise the saw wasn't running right as far as he was concerned. There are guys like that out there too. But to Bob's point, to close off this part of the discussion, is I will always concede to Bob's statistical analysis because, as he said, he's been doing it since the Earth's crust cooled off, and he has hundreds and hundreds of more saws out there than, of course, I'm ever going to see, period. Conversely, everything I do on this channel, just like schooling from Bob, it's going to be out there. You're living it the same as I'm living it, whether I'm learning something or I'm working on something. So, no, I don't have a problem with you stating that and doing a slight correction.
the two that actually had the PTO, the same guy, and boy, he's hard on saws.
So let me ask you
He
this.
doesn't blow them up, he runs them over.
Let me ask you this, because you're into numbers, and I'm not sure I'll put this in the video.
Oh, that's all right.
How many bearings have you changed? Since, say, January?
None.
So you have changed no bearings since January.
No, the only bottom end failure that's actually been, I mean, those two older saws, the original ones, I've had those for a while. When he just brought me, the other one where the crank started wasn't compressed enough. That was this year.
And that's one. All right. So,
Yeah.
so say from 2000.
But that case is wrecked, so you can't.
Yeah. When did we start talking about turning those? 2014 or 15?
Talking about two and what?
Tuning the X-Torques down to 13,000 versus letting them spin out to 13.3. 2014 or 15 or 16? When did,
Probably 14 or 15 when we started. You know, it's, when we.
so how many bottom end bearings on X-Torques have you had to replace since that period of time, roughly? You're not going to remember one of them.
Honest to God, you know, like one a year.
So this
Maybe
is
like a high year, maybe sometimes some years. And I'm thinking back to like,
okay.
you know, but it's maybe, you know, like there was that period where they were in. I was seeing more of it on the red ones actually, because I got a batch of the red ones, the Johns rids that were right in that window where they were putting them in wrong, like you fixed yours.
Right.
But aside from that, one or two a year, and that's
Okay.
it.
Now listen to me carefully because I'm going somewhere with this. I would say, at a minimum, I do 4 or 5 a year.
I haven't done that many like in the last.
Okay, let's think about that. And this is the point. This is the point. Most of the saws that you've worked on are ones that you sold.
A fair amount have, but there's so many saws out there. We got a good reputation as far
And
as
the ones that came in, how many of those that you did bearings on did you actually sell?
two.
And that's my
And
point.
I know just who they are.
And I'll tell you what, and that's my whole point. All this does is it highlights.
Randy and Mike. Yeah.
It highlights the difference between the guys who go for the bottom dollar and grab them off of Boonville, because that's where a lot of them came from. Other places where they're just walking out with a box without understanding how to set them up and buying from a guy who knows how to set them up. And that's really the hidden story here, is the saws that are put together and looked at and set up right are statistically less likely to have those kind of problems. Most of the saws that I've worked on, like you said, were from dealers that don't do that kind of work, but they also don't set the saws up.
But a lot of it's improper setup. You know, though we get, you know, obviously we get saws that were sold at Boonville. We get saws coming in from all over.
And you pointed out when we first started the video prep was, I made the point of all the ones I sent out with my nachos, none of them come back. But the second part of that equation is I always tune them before they
Yeah.
go out the door.
Well, it's like those two that the guy, you know, the same guy lost them. I mean, you know, the guys, if the saw's not set up right, the earlier ones were going too.
The point is this, is what Bob is saying you can take to the bank. Statistically speaking, if you have a good dealer, the chances of bottom end bearing failures on an X-Torq are no greater or worse than any other chainsaw. And he's putting his reputation out there and saying, look, I can prove it because I'm living it.
If I saw the failure percentage that you see, and there's different parameters that drive you to see what you see,
Well, I think we need to
they
discuss
would,
that more.
I wouldn't sell them. Because I wouldn't want to live through all those, you know, because the thing is, you know, when somebody brings you something that's broken, it's a little different, because you didn't sell it to them.
That's correct.
Yeah, I can't be, you know, there's no way I could sell anything that would have the failure rate that you've got the perception on some of those. I just wouldn't do it, because I wouldn't want to live with all those failures.
Well, there's that, but the hammered point home, again, and I think this is really the heart of the matter, is statistically, his X-Torques that he sold have not come back with failures regardless of years, in any greater numbers than before.
Well, it's just within that window where they were putting the bearings in a little bit skewed.
Okay.
That's the
And-
only time.
And I'm gonna say at this point in time, I haven't seen him with tags past 2016. Okay? So that's two pieces of raw data here. The third piece of the puzzle that I didn't pick up on, that Bob brought up inadvertently, was that when I change my bearings out, I also reset the saws to where I like them in terms of tuning. And I always set them at like 12.8, 12.9, and you probably see that on the videos. So they're going out the door, turned down.
Yeah, the ones that you've turned down aren't failing either.
No. And I'm saying the ones I put my bearings in are not failing. And your interpretation is because I'm setting them up properly as they go out the door.
Yeah.
And if you add that to Bob's experience of setting them up properly going out the door, that makes a lot of sense now, doesn't it?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, even everything that's totally properly set up,
You're going to have statistics.
you're still going to have, you know, you can still have a 1% failure rate, which is considered acceptable.
Okay.
You know, but
So have we beat this to death yet?
I think we've beat it to death.
Okay.
But I think I think it's at the same time it's kind of clarifying, which I didn't really want a misconception that there's a high probability of X-Torq bottom end failures versus the original edition saws. And what I'm saying is they're pretty much the same.